It's not surprising at all that soon after the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Uyghur Human Rights Act of 2019, China voiced its indignation, saying the U.S. slanders China's de-radicalization and anti-terrorism efforts and is making groundless accusations against the Chinese government. So why is Washington passing the bill now? How will this affect the ongoing China-U.S. trade talks? And what is the situation in Xinjiang? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by He Jing, attorney at the Angel Law Firm, Huo Zhengxin, professor of law at China University of Political Science and Law, and Anna Tangen, current affairs commentator. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our discussion here. Professor Huo, what do you make of the timing of the House to approve this law about human rights in Xinjiang?
Okay, frankly speaking, as a law professor, I usually do not interpret law from perspective of politics. However, the successive legislative move in the U.S. Congress in the past years make me cannot help associate these acts with China-U.S. relationship. Because as you know that in December 2017, Donald Trump defined China as a strategic competitor, which mines the American values and interests. So I think that since December 2017, the China-U.S. relationship changed fundamentally. And then we find that in 2018, the U.S. Congress passed Taiwan Travel Act, and in just last week, it passed Hong Kong Act, and then the House of Representatives passed bill relates to Xinjiang. So I think that this means that playing tough on China become Americans' new policy, which I think is a negative policy, a negative signal to the Chinese governments.
Is this move obviously and politically motivated?
Yes, this is the ugly face of American exceptionalism. This idea that there can only be one cookie-cutter solution to all countries and cultures. And frankly, I would agree with my colleague on this. It's obviously been politicized. But you know, there's a real dangerous line that's being crossed here, because once you have Washington deciding what's going to happen in Beijing, they're also going to start saying, oh, what should be happening in Iran and Venezuela, everywhere. So you cannot have one country which is dictating the course of history and government, politics and law in other countries. It just won't stand. And unfortunately, this will be the demise of American exceptionalism and the U.S.'s leading role in the world today.
You know, I don't want to speculate whether there's a coordinated effort between White House and the U.S. Congress. I think, as a matter of fact, that probably the U.S. Congress always have this kind of concerns or watches about what's happening in Xinjiang, and the kind of bill probably been cooking for quite a while. Right now, probably the Congress, whoever supports the bill sees that it's good timing in terms of political climate in the Washington, D.C. That's why they put it on for votes, and then they got this through. That's probably what's really happening right now.
There's obviously the campaign of geopolitical rivalry between the two countries, the two biggest economies. But what about domestic politics in the United States? Nancy Pelosi, spokesperson of the House, says so many things about or bad-mouthing China all the time. Do you think this is a part of the motivation to serve the purpose of winning the next election 1 year from now? Anna?
No, I don't think it's an thing. If you go back in history, either under Obama, etc., you're going to find that most of the Democrats were firmly anti-China, mostly on what they called human rights basis and things like that. It was generally the Republicans that moderated it because they said, look, it's a business relationship and we have to step very, very carefully. Remember, you know, Nixon was a Republican. And so you have this situation now where the Democrats were being set up by Donald Trump to be blamed. They said, oh, you know, China wants a Democratic president. Why? Because they'll be soft on China. And I think the Democrats are going a little bit overboard at this point to try to convince people that they're even tougher on China than Trump is. Now, it's Trump, ironically, who is now in the seat where he's saying, well, you know, this isn't helpful to my trade deal. both Hong Kong and the Uyghur situation. He says he's going to sign them because they've been passed unanimously, basically, all except one vote in the House and probably unanimously in the Senate. So he's not in a position to do it, but he's adding this caveat that he reserves the power of the executive in terms of making foreign policy.
I just want to add one very important information. As my colleague mentioned just now, the bills of Hong Kong and now the bills of Xinjiang receive almost unanimous support in Congress. So I think that this is sending a very strong political policy. That is to say,
political message.
Yes. Playing tough on China becomes a political correctness in the United States. So I think that would undermine the ongoing negotiations between the two governments.
The negotiations about the trade balance. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's a little bit unfortunate, right, to see how this happened. Somehow it's really just to see that it's actually something safe, probably, for the U.S. Congress people to do it. It's easy and safe for them to target at China under the name of the human rights and the process, like have this kind of bipartisan support.
No, absolutely. I mean, you can do no wrong politically, especially as we're leading up to next November, by bashing China. But the real issue is, going forward, where we know at some point there will be a recession. And the question then becomes, what are the realities? I mean, it's going to be clear that Donald Trump has caused immense damage to the U.S. economic interests. And when that happens, the question is, who's going to pick up the pieces and put something back together with China? Because it's very difficult to separate them, despite this kind of falling apart.
China has been taken as an adversary, strategic competitor by the U.S. House, the Senate, and it's increasingly a bipartisan consensus across the aisle in the D.C. Now, in the case of passing the Hong Kong bill on human rights and democracy, the Chinese authorities very quickly rolled out measures, including punishment against some of the NGOs or think tanks that must have financially supported rioters in Hong Kong. Also, there wouldn't be any port calls by American military vessels in Hong Kong. Do you think such similar curve of escalation between the two governments is likely to be repeated in the case of Xinjiang? I mean, will the Chinese government be forced to take more retaliatory measures against the U.S. government? Because after all, things between the two strong powers, although China is far behind the U.S. militarily, economically, but it is something that is taking place between the two biggest economies. So do you think there's a strong possibility that the Chinese government will retaliate?
Well, first of all, I should say that as a law professor, and I think the most Chinese and in the whole world, we want to see a good cooperation between the two countries that will benefit not only the two countries, but the whole world. But now I think that the signal sending from the U.S. is negative. As a sovereign country, I think that it is logic that China is entitled to take countermeasures to defend its dignity and sovereignty. So I think it's hardly possible.
Well, I see the response as asymmetric. I mean, this is fairly mild in the broad scheme of things. They didn't say, look, we're going to start censoring your institutions and things like that. I think China is really biding its time. Right now, people, if you look what happened in Europe just recently with the leaders literally laughing at Donald Trump, I think the world is now positioned for what the post-Trump world is going to look like. And whether that's 1 year or 5 years, the issue is that Trump has lost a tremendous amount of credibility. So I think China is doing the right thing by not trying to engage in heavy-handed retaliation, but really just letting the rest of the world see that this is just ridiculous, that you cannot have one country dictating policy.
Jing, don't you think this president, Donald Trump, is far less interested in issues of human rights, ideology, and democracy? Because he was quoted as saying that Hong Kong was, after all, just an issue of internal affairs for the Chinese mainland. So the Chinese authorities should have some strong reservations about what we call retaliations, because this guy Mr. Donald Trump is not known for being political or ideological.
But still, right, for him it's relatively easy to take it along, right, sign the Hong Kong bill, whether ideologically he supports that or not, but it's something easy for him to do it, politically speaking. So, but I think at the bigger picture that from all of this is that, again, this really reminds all of us that the human rights or climate change or all those things are the current, the priority of all the global affairs. Yes, politically speaking, I think China will reject whatever what has been said, right, by the U.S. Congress. But ultimately, this is really the thing that these are global affairs issues that we have to really find effective ways to deal with it, or have people know about it, have people understand it, and make sure we are being proactive instead of always being the target of being attacked.
No, but I mean, think of it in another way. Nancy Pelosi has now positioned Trump that if he makes any deal with China, he will be looking weak. They will be looking strong against China. It'll look like Trump is giving in. And I think this is very deliberate, and that's why I go back to your initial point that this is increasingly looking like internal politics to the U.S. How can the Democrats, in essence, back Trump into a corner? He was going to make them look weak on China, and instead, now they're making him look weak. He's the one who's adding caveats saying, well, we're trying to make a trade deal here and things like this. So I think there's a little bit of political judo going on, using what he thought was his strength against him.
Yes, indeed, it does make sense that the field would be viewed as being the first to blink in the standoff, either between the United States and China or domestically across the aisle between Democrats and Republicans. The issue is the Chinese government, in its response, very quick response to the latest enacting of the Bill of Human Rights in Xinjiang, listed several things. One was that over the past decades, Xinjiang became prosperous per capita or GDP, or in the past 3 years, no single act of terrorist attacks has taken place since the vocational training centers for Uyghurs have been set up to improve the labor skills so that Uyghurs could possibly find jobs. And now this very idea of setting up the vocational training centers comes under fire from the United States, and media in the West captured this issue as live ammunition in their attacks against China. So what do you know about the training center? And the second point, Professor Huo, the Chinese government said the United States exercises double standards. They don't have, in Chinese, they have their own problems. So, like a gun-related violence, a violation of civil liberty one way or another, and particularly abuse and torture of POWs in Guantanamo. You can raise a number of examples to illustrate that the United States is in fact in a weak position, but at the same time they lash out against China. So many observers, Chinese and foreign alike, would say, hey, why does the United States always exercise the so-called long-arm jurisdiction to interfere with internal affairs? What's the culture in the United States that backs up the U.S. legal practice outside its boundary? Mr. He.
Again, like I said, that all the human rights are actually considered as the global agenda, global affairs. And the United States do not think, hey, we were talking about the human rights because it's our internal affairs, our domestic law issues. They are doing this under the name of the global priority. Same thing like climate change or the anti-terrorism, and these are the global issues. I think that's where they're coming from. If you're looking at the international law, human rights is indeed one of the top issues. Now we can comment on the human rights situation of other countries as well, right? When that's really a big issue. Mm-hmm. So. Again, I think for us, for China, we produce results. China produce results. We produce enormous great results in Xinjiang. Now, there's one issue is about at what cost, right?
What do
right
you
now,
mean by results?
No, results like that. I traveled to Xinjiang the last 2 years, and we spent the
You mean
holidays here.
dividends of maintaining peace and law and
Yeah, I'm
order?
talking about economy growth.
That's dividends of
we
stability
get
in
rid of
Xinjiang.
this terrorism act. That's a result. Okay, that's a real results. And then railway, high-speed railway. I mean, railway has been built, and then the economy is in a good pace, and in the international trade.
Particularly, there is the current boom of tourism, given this
200 million in the first 10 months of this year.
Exactly.
And
28% increase.
There are
in
huge
trade.
potentials. There are huge potentials. I love this. I really love Xinjiang. Xinjiang has huge potential, and there are a lot of results being produced. Now, the one thing we have to do the much better is we have to. Yes, there are probably some. The Americans said, well, at a huge cost, at the cost of human rights. Is that really true? It's our job. I mean, it's a Chinese job to explain that question. It's not American. Americans, they're just good at accuse. They worry about it. They have all sort of stuff they want to say. But it's our job to explain, hey, we produce results, and what are the costs we have incurred. We have to be really authentic about it.
Well, I think there's another aspect to this, which is this issue. There's a real difference in terms of cultural thinking about the individual and society. In Asia, obviously the society is first and the individual is second. And if you go out, and it's reversed in the West, human rights, as defined in the West, is your ability to go out and protest, slogans, all of these kind of political freedoms. Whereas human rights in the East tends to be more about economic, your ability to walk...
Subsistence.
Not just subsistence, the ability to walk safely in any city in China. Order. The ability to have economic opportunity, education, access to social net, all of these things are considered the human rights, and these are the priorities. Where in the West, the thinking about human rights, and it might be, as you said, a middle-class issue.
Yes, the West imposed huge weight on freedom of speech, on privacy. So for them, anything like an invasion of those is like intolerable cost.
Yeah, right. But if you, and this is the difference, if you went in the U.S. and you talked to people in the street, they would give you an earful and say, yeah, we disagree, there's, human rights is very important. But if you go around in China, major cities, minor cities, villages, and you ask them what they think about Hong Kong, what they think about Xinjiang, what you're going to get is a very, very harsh...
about the importance of protecting human rights, and we are all entitled to the freedom of speech, and that's taken for granted for sure. It's part of the civil society and dignity of a human being. As we get integrated with the rest of the world, as we get more modernized in updating our institutions one way or another. However, the issue is how to de-radicalize the appeal for example, protection of Islamism or whatever. In the wake of the Cold War, I mean, why do we have this radicalization of some of the religious beliefs?
Yeah.
In Xinjiang, what we have in the high-handed crackdown very much refers to how to de-radicalize and get rid of extremism.
Yes. I think that there is a lot of causes for extremism and the terrorism. As you know, that from the 1990s till 2015 and 16, Xinjiang suffered a lot from terrorism and extremisms. And now I find that Chinese government...
I'm going to interest you. Most people in the West are not aware that there were thousands of attacks and deaths during that period because the Chinese government did not publicize it.
You know why
so
the Chinese government refused to publicize the gruesome pictures about decapitating
they're afraid of populist
afraid
reaction.
Of, exactly, widespread violence against the Uyghurs or other
right now,
perpetrators of religious extremism.
Right now, if you talk to anybody, they say, oh, what deaths? This is all made up. But the fact is, it's there. It's on video. There's footage showing that, but people weren't aware of it. So they're just saying, oh, I mean, I've heard on the shows people just saying, I said, why would China be doing anything in Xinjiang? You think that they just want to, terrorize a nice group of people who are getting along fine? No, this was an issue about absolute safety. You cannot have a group that is descending into radicalism like this. Now, here's the irony. In the U.S., no one wants, they were threatening to hang a member of Congress, a sitting member of Congress, because she was Islamic. I mean, is this the kind of things?
I mean, we followed what happened on the social media in the wake of September 11th terrorist attacks back in the year 2001. Americans were debating why we had so much hate speech that went viral on the social media against the United States. They hate America, a lot of anti-U.S. sentiments arising from the Middle East. So the very reason, some of the Chinese argue here in the mainland, the very reason why we prevent the spread of hate photos and hate speeches, quote unquote, denouncing violence and extremism perpetrated by the religious activists, exactly serves the purpose that no such hate speech should be spread to minimize the negative impact of such, arrest. What do you think of the enormous efforts by the Chinese government and people in Xinjiang, particularly the Han people there, to exercise utmost restraint?
I think there is a common Chinese saying, which is practice is the sore test of truth. As you mentioned just now, in the recent 3 years, there was no terrorist attack in Xinjiang. And so I think that Chinese government has found a very comprehensive methods or way to solve the deep-rooted causes for extremism and terrorism. I think that the lack of education, the lack of especially legal education, the lack of access to jobs, the lack of work skills are the most important reasons. Therefore, China, in these vocational centers, the trainees usually receive different kinds of training programs to improve their languages, to learn history, law, and also they are provided with different programs to improve their job skills. So usually they can have a better job. So I think this benefits themselves, their families and the communities, and these can solve the problems of extremism and terrorism, I think.
These few years saw up to 1,000 people in different forms being invited by local authorities in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Regions to take a look at the vocational training centers. But some of the skeptical Western reporters came back with negative reports about the training centers. But the Guardian recently reported that up to 116 convicted and suspected terrorists in UK live in the community under the little-known DDP, or Desistance and Disengagement Program scheme. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying said the U.S. is also trying to use community correction to rehabilitate young people affected by extremist ideas. So is this a double standard? Is this a double standard on China's anti-terrorism effort?
Yeah, I mean, it smacks of hypocrisy, but the main issue here is what is China trying to do, and it's about re-education. Now, the government does bear some blame here because they were very lax. They allowed Xinjiang parents to take their girls and some of their boys out of school, out of mandatory education, which is required under Chinese law, because they said, well, let's give them some leeway. But what happened is because they couldn't learn, Mandarin, they didn't have any skills, they didn't know science, they didn't have a trade, right? They were basically creating an apartheid system where you had these people, Uyghurs, who were in essence had no economic opportunity and therefore would be ripe for being targeted by extremist groups, especially radical Islamic extremist groups who were trying to create this independent state idea.
Yes, indeed, those who were less educated young Uyghurs are more subject to the influence of religious extremism. I went to Xinjiang and I took a look at the classroom where young Uyghurs were learning Mandarin, because a good command of Mandarin would of course help them find or have easy access to the job market. Most of the Western media have demonized the Chinese government in terms of the vocational education. What do you have to say, He?
I think our Chinese position is all these designs or system vocational training program, all this are under the consideration of a preventive programs. Preventive policy is actually always in all sorts of anti-terrorism measures. If you go anywhere, go to U.S., go to UK, and some of the kind of measures which arguably have the effect of limiting person's liberty are actually be given really for the purpose of prevent something much more horrible to happen. And all these designs, all these programs have to really look at it from this local context. I think this is something got misperceived. And this is also something probably we didn't really explain clearly. I mean, China have not really explained clearly. This is all local. All the preventive mechanisms are local. And it's very hard to looking at, it's very hard to apply a global standard looking at. I think this is where the things get all really messed up.
Well, surprisingly, few, if any, from Muslim countries have protested against the program of re-education for the young Uyghurs in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Yet the United States stood out. Some of the European politicians stood out to protest against the establishment of training centers for the young Uyghurs. What do you think of the differences between Western countries and Islamic countries?
Well, I noticed that so far there are some, China says that more than 60 countries endorsed the Chinese policy in Xinjiang, including some Muslim countries. So I think that these suggest
that last October at a committee session of UN General Assembly, more than 60 countries said that the tremendous human rights progress has been achieved in Xinjiang.
So it seems that the U.S. U.S. is only a superpower in the whole world. Therefore, U.S. always believe that they are the symbol of justice, and they usually believe that the system different from their own should be bad or even evil. Therefore, I think that the U.S. watched the world with colored glasses. So this may explain why the U.S. sometimes stood out. And these Muslim countries, they even support the Chinese policy.
Well, the issue of hegemony, is it more about moral leadership? Is it more about the world order? Is it more about the incompatible competitions between the two biggest economies?
No,
what do you make of the U.S. government and its strategic intent?
Okay, I mean, you can go back to Francis Fukuyama and his, the end of the world, the last man standing, this idea. This was written at the just after he had served in Reagan's administration. And there was this belief in this brave new world, which was there would only be one system, liberal democratic capitalism, and that this was the destiny of humankind, regardless of past cultures. So that goes forward. It became American exceptionalism, the idea that in pursuit of this beacon on a hill that we should all be going to, that it was okay to do some things like start wars, murders, change regimes, things like this. So that is what has come out of this. Is there's this now firm belief, even though Fukuyama is backing away from his original contention in his subsequent books, people, especially in the U.S.
I think the identity is a much bigger concern these days for all those groups. People really trying to fight or protect the identity. Okay, so I think this really illustrates probably the challenges of the rule of law. China really committed to become, have a more of a rule of law component system. But now when dealing with a huge problem like this, rule of law will be always looking at it from all angles.
Is it true somehow that 3 years ago, when extremism prevailed somehow and plagued Xinjiang, kind of a curfew had been declared, a kind of a state of emergency has been declared, very much like in the Second World War when the Japanese were put into the same place to deprive them of their freedom when the United States was at war with Japan after Pearl Harbor. What do you make of this kind of?
I don't think
so.
Yeah, no. I mean, when you start talking about what happened in the Second World War with the Japanese, who were just rounded up without anything, there wasn't any kind of preventative situation there. There was just mass hysteria. If there had been preventative, what happened? Why weren't the Italians rounded up and put away? Why weren't the Germans rounded up and put in concentration camps? This was very, very selective. Things. In this particular case, from the Chinese government's point of view, it's their duty to prevent future violence. This is the #1 rule of the government. You cannot have a civil society unless you can walk the streets.
It's what we call a campaign of de-radicalization. Thank you for being with us. Until next time. Goodbye.